episode of Progress, Potential, and Possibilities, discussions with fascinating people designing a better tomorrow for all of us. I'm your host, Ira Pastor. Welcome everybody again to another episode of our show with another really fascinating guest today, helping to create a better tomorrow on many different fronts. And if you're anything like me and you keep CNBC running on low volume during the day to keep up with your investment portfolio, then no doubt you will have seen and listened to today's guest many times. And we are honored to be joined today by Jacob Walthour Jr., who is co-founder of the investment firm Blueprint Capital Advisors, which offers a range of investment advisory and portfolio management services, manages over $1.2 billion of their clients' wealth. Mr. Walthour has spent over 30 years in the capital markets, doing traditional and alternative asset management. Prior to founding Blueprint, he served as the vice chairman of product and business development at the investment management division of Cowen Company, also serving on their firm's management committee. Prior to that, managing director of Cliffwater, which is a leading provider of alternative consulting, serving on their firm's investment committee. And prior to joining Cliffwater, he was a partner managing director at Citadel Investment Group, managing the firm's North American distribution efforts. Mr. Walthour has his bachelor's degree from Nelson Rockefeller School at State University of New York at Albany, and he serves on several corporate boards, additionally Parkview Capital Credit, Transportation Demand Management, and he was the chair of Ebony Media Holdings through its recent sale. And he also serves on, or he continues to serve, or has served on many boards of several nonprofits and philanthropic organizations, including the Margaret A. Cargill Philanthropy, the investment subcommittee of the Girl Scouts of America, the director at the Robert F. Kennedy Center for Human Rights, trustee for the New York Foundation of the Arts, director of New York Cares, and trustee of the ECLC School for Children and Adults with Learning Disabilities. And Mr. Walthour, in addition to CNBC, has been a frequent speaker at various pension, hedge funds, and alternative investment management conferences, and contributed to a range of articles and Vanity Fair, Wall Street Journal, Bloomberg, and so forth. Jacob Walthour Jr., thank you so much for taking the time to come on the show today.
Hey, thanks for having me. Really appreciate the opportunity to be here with you, Ira.
Yeah, it's great having you. And, I typically, I start things off typically by handing our guests the floor for a bit to talk about themselves. But I'd like to start differently today. And
Sure.
if you would, I'd like to start off not with you, but with Barbara Jean and Jake Walthour Sr., because I think the story of them is a big part of your story as well. And if you could sort of take us on a little journey to start with about your parents, everything about sort of the Savoy and the Hudson Valley community. I think they're a very important part of where we're going to be going with this whole story. So take some time to introduce your parents, if you would.
I must say that I'm really proud to have the parents that I have. And if it were not for them, all of the accomplishments and organizations that I've been involved in, the titles I've been able to achieve wouldn't have been possible without them. And when I say that, I don't just mean they did a great job, raising me as a child. My parents have always been my biggest supporters and my chief advisors throughout my entire life. And to those who know them, they're a very special couple. Unfortunately, my dad passed away in December of this year from the COVID-19 virus on the 57th anniversary that the two of them shared. And so he's deeply missed. But I have to say he lived a full life, and I got the benefit of every bit of wisdom he ever had. My parents, as I just mentioned, were married for 57 years. And they're a couple who were not only married to each other, they were business partners. And to be married to someone, as most people know, is difficult enough. I think half of marriages end up in failure. To be able to have a successful marriage and to be able to have business success together, that was really, something special to observe over the years. Neither of my parents graduated from high school, but always really impressed upon us the value of education. And back then, you didn't spoil the child and you didn't spare the rod. So, we always feared what would happen if we didn't, have academic success. As I mentioned, they owned a business together, and they ran that business for 35 years. It was a restaurant called the Savoy, which is famous not just to people who who live in Hudson and have grown up in Hudson, but people who visited Hudson and visited Soloia always remark that it's one of their favorite places to have ever visited. And I think it was something special, which is a testament to who they are. I mean, they grew up in a difficult time in American history and witnessed the pain and suffering that went on during the civil rights movement, whether it was hoses or dogs, you name it, police brutality. And they always had this vision of creating their own business and recycling their profits into the community. And they were able to do that, but they took it a step further and always made sure that they didn't isolate kind of the Black community where their business was located. They wanted to integrate communities. And I can't say that we sat down at the kitchen table and we developed a formula for how that happened, but we had one of the most culturally, ethnically, racially, financially diverse clienteles over 35 years that a restaurant could ever hope for. And again, I don't think it was some magical design that we created. I think it had a lot to do with the warm personality of my parents and their willingness to be accepting of anyone and their willingness to run their business in a way that anyone and everyone would feel comfortable. And so, they had tremendous success, which my family was able to benefit from. Each of us as kids were able to benefit from. But more importantly, the community was able to benefit from. They would feed the elderly. They would support the basketball teams. If someone passed away, they would hold, a repast, free of charge. If someone was wrongfully arrested, they would be there to provide bail at 3 o'clock in the morning. Over time, they did some pretty amazing things. And I always viewed it as a privilege that my friends called my dad, Dad. And my friends called my mom, Mom. And I have to honestly say that, I couldn't think of two people who I would have selected, over the two people who gave birth to me and raised me and really instilled me with all the values that they did.
I appreciate you sharing that, and I'm very sorry for the loss of your father recently. And as I said, I wanted to at least lay the ground with that story because they were the write up on both of them was very inspirational, and so I thank you for sharing that part. Now, Jacob Walthour Jr., you come along. You've had a very successful career on Wall Street. Obviously, we see you every week or so on CNBC. But there was a couple major parts of your success. Not only did you spend these 30 years or so rising on Wall Street to increasing levels of power and importance, but you also, secondarily to that, I look at what you currently do now. You manage over $1 billion of your clients' money, and you don't manage thousands of small retail investors. These are a handful of significant clients. Talk just a little bit, if you would, about your time, and we'll get into some of the other issues we're going to be talking about on the show, but talk a little bit about your rise and also sort of your experience with what it took to become, and not just the manager of finance for somebody at a company like Cowen or so forth, but on your own, that here, I'm Jacob Walthour Jr., you trust me with $1 billion. Take us on that.
Right. It all started at a very early age. And I think it had a lot to do with, growing up in a family that owned their own business. Sitting around the table, watching my dad kind of do the numbers, watching my mom kind of do the books, hearing them talk about the decisions that they had to make. I guess you could say I sort of was trained at a very early age to have a business mind. And for me, it was absolutely fascinating to sit there and not just listen to the discussion, but participate in the discussion. And I really do think that that's one thing that, we don't see a lot of today, is sort of parents and their children kind of sitting around the table and kind of talking about life and talking about business. And so I was fortunate enough to have parents who did that, almost every single morning, because we were open, 7 days a week. And so, I grew up always knowing that I wanted to be in business. I didn't want to be a school teacher, didn't want to be a social worker. I wanted to have some role in business, and I was attracted to Wall Street. And why was I attracted to Wall Street? Because that's where the money was, right? And I think I understood at a very early age from listening to my parents talk, there were tough times when there weren't enough money, and there were really good times when there was a lot of money. And so if I could figure out how money worked, how money flowed, how to properly allocate money and profit from money, then I thought I could take, myself to a whole nother level, growing up in this small town of 6,000. And more importantly, I could uplift my family and my community, because I thought about what it really meant to work on Wall Street. It meant you were developing a lot of expertise. You were elbow to elbow with some of the most sophisticated minds around the world in finance. You were dealing with big dollars and learning how to allocate big dollars. You were learning how to do corporate and credit analysis. And so I just said to myself, I can develop a skill set that could be very helpful to my community. At the same time, Wall Street was one of the careers where you got paid a lot of money for the hours that you put in. Now, having said that, we put a lot of hours in, but my compensation relative to the compensation of my peers seemed to be multiples. And as I got on in my career, that spread seemed to only grow. And so I always thought about it as not just an opportunity for myself, but an opportunity to take my family and my community to the next level. And that's really kind of what I've been able to do over 30 plus years. But, again, back to the training of my parents, it's not just about profits, it's also about people. And it's that second part of it that really keeps you, super motivated when you think about all the good that you can do with money.
Yep, absolutely. Jake, I think a couple of months ago, I forget if it was where you were being interviewed, but you basically were mentioning, just because I am a successful Wall Street person, manager of money, and I am African American, does not mean that I need to go manage money in Cleveland, Detroit, Atlanta, Georgia. I can manage money on Long Island, Silicon Valley, Beverly Hills, wherever
Absolutely.
you send me. There was this article in Bloomberg several months ago, Black and White on Wall Street, the Unwritten Code on Race. We're talking about these 13 microaggressions, things like, talking with a white voice, not complaining about diversity training, and so forth. Talk us a little bit through your own experiences with this sort of group of microaggressions as you came up the ladder on Wall Street.
Sure. So being on Wall Street for 30 years, I witnessed and experienced, my fair share of racism. And, one of the things that, I appreciate about Wall Street is that, racism doesn't take the place in really overt forms, right? You don't walk in the morning and find a noose at your desk. People don't kind of say things, out in the public that would be offensive to their colleagues. It's really far more sophisticated, invisible, what I'll call systemic racism that exists on Wall Street. And it takes the form in certain people being paid more, certain people being staffed on prestigious deals that gets them notoriety and attention and helps them build out their resume, certain people being promoted over other people. And so, when I think back over the course of 30 years, there was a really high attrition rate among African Americans. In other words, we would get hired because we had all the skills, whether it be academic credentials, willingness to work hard, sort of an ethical approach to business. We had it all, but we didn't have staying power for some reason. And I think when I look back on it, it had all to do with the fact that many of us got frustrated. We got frustrated seeing people get paid more for doing the same work. We got frustrated seeing people always get selected to work on the big deals. We got frustrated seeing people get promoted over us that we were older than or more experienced than. And we knew kind of what was driving, those personnel decisions that was to the advantage of others and to the disadvantage of us. It had a lot to do with family connections. Their dad went to school with, one of the dads that was a managing director, or they went to the same, boarding schools. As African Americans, we didn't go to boarding schools. We didn't even know what boarding schools were. Yeah. You know, he played lacrosse and the managing director played lacrosse. Well, as African Americans, we had no idea what lacrosse even was as a sport. And so I would say that, you know, over the course of 30 years, just witnessing that systemic racism, you know, makes me look back on all the careers that were shortened because they couldn't survive. They couldn't, you know, overcome, you know, what was occurring to them. And I say to myself, if everybody could have lasted as long as I've lasted, you know, the resources that families would have and the resources that communities would have would be far greater than it is today. And that's one of the things I don't think people really think about when it comes to an African American on Wall Street. Systemic racism doesn't just affect the individual in most cases. As a kid who grew up in a town of 6,000, where, you know, neither of my parents graduated from high school, you know, the ability to make $500,000 or $1 million a year is game changing, not just for me, but for my parents, my siblings, for, you know, the community at large that benefits from my nonprofit contributions, et cetera. Family members who may need a loan to put a down payment on a house. It is truly, you know, a game changing experience. And so I certainly wish systemic racism didn't exist, but it does. I think I was fortunate in that my dad would never let me quit. He just kept encouraging me to power through it. Just keep working harder, just keep working longer hours, just keep working smarter. I will say this, over the course of a 30-year career, no one put in more hours than I did. I won't claim to be the smartest guy on any deal that I ever worked on. In fact, you know, one of my prerequisites when I'm trying to hire people is that they're smarter than I am, or at least in some area. They bring more of a skill set than I have. But, you know, what I'll say to you is that, you know, over that 30-year career, I think I figured out how to look the other way, how to carefully manage my approach to issues when they came up. And I would be able to benefit from my ability to adapt and do that.
And now moving on to an issue where you didn't look the other way, and obviously anything I ask here, if there's legal issues or whatever, don't talk about them. That's fine. But recently, you filed one of the largest racial discrimination cases in New Jersey. New Jersey has an African American community around 17% currently. Only 1% of the estate, the $80 billion in the state pension fund managed by African Americans. Talk a little bit about why you decided not to look the other way with this particular case, and a little bit of what's going on here with not just the state, but also the BlackRock situation, if you could talk about it.
I got tired, okay? And, you know, I got sick and tired of being sick and tired. And more importantly, with respect to this lawsuit that my firm, Blueprint Capital Advisors, has filed against, you know, Governor Phil Murphy, the Division of Investment, Division of Treasury, et cetera. You know, I worked for 30 years to build a professional reputation, to learn all that I did. But my ancestors in this country worked for 350 years to put me in a position where I could leverage everything they had poured into me and produce something that had the ability to make a lot of money, to generate real wealth, and to put my family up there among some of the greatest inventors and business people, entrepreneurs of our time. And that was called the FAIR program. And it was all of my experiences from all the places I ever worked, everything I've ever learned, coming together in a way that I thought was going to transform how money was managed on Wall Street. And when the state of New Jersey, for 9 months, took all of our intellectual property and proprietary information and stole it, I thought that to just walk away from this would be to disrespect and dishonor all of the people who had ever invested in me, all of my relatives who had ever sacrificed to put me in the position to create what we call today, you know, Blueprint Capital Advisors. And so, yes, I was tired, but importantly, they weren't just stealing from me. They were stealing from my family, and they were stealing from the community. And I felt it was time to fight back. You know, we're in a different era right now.
Sure.
And, you know, I was looking at my children after the death of George Floyd, leave the house every day, with signs and going out and protesting. And I said to myself also, like, how can I sit there and watch my kids muster up the kind of courage that we haven't seen since the 1960s, and me myself, sit back and be silent about an injustice of a different type that took place against me. And so that sort of sums it up as to why, I ultimately decided to file a lawsuit. It would have been a dishonor and disrespect to my family. It was robbing me and my community of a substantial opportunity to generate wealth. And I had that inspiration and push from my kids, who motivated me to say, I'm going to do this. And then I would say the fourth thing, I had God on my side. I knew once I did this that people would retaliate. The state of New Jersey retaliated, right? I knew other people in the investment management community would look at me differently. I had the risk of being blacklisted, but I had to say, be comfortable in your faith, right? If you're doing the right things for the right reasons, everything will eventually come back to you. So go ahead, pay it forward, and let's see where the chips fall.
You talked a little bit earlier about, when African Americans do well, they don't just do well for themselves. You don't just change your life, you change the community that you come from. And obviously you work at sort of one end of the investment spectrum. People have done well and you grow their wealth, and that's awesome. We have a lot of African American guests on the show from biotech, from government, from academia. There's the whole first part of that process, sort of the whole private equity scene, how we get past these valleys of death and start these new companies. Just love to get your input a little bit on what you see. Obviously, you focus a lot on the wealth management and the growth of the wealth, but any interesting insights with regard to the private equity scene, especially as we focus on the African American inventor community?
Look, I think the private equity space is critically important to the African American community. At the end of the day, because of systemic racism, we have suffered from lack of access to capital. And in many cases, African Americans have been paid less than other people, on Wall Street. Now, what I don't want to do is give the impression that life is not good. I mean, we've done very well for ourselves, amassed game-changing wealth, and been able to share that wealth with the broader community. So I want to be sure to keep it in perspective. We've done well, but I think we can do better. And one of the vehicles by which we can do better is private equity and venture capital. Great ideas without money behind them in the form of venture capital sort of die on the vine. And so if we have a healthy and vibrant African American venture capital community, and more importantly, a healthy and vibrant global venture capital community that really is looking for African American entrepreneurs to back them, we would have a lot more sort of successful companies that we would all hear about above and beyond the local level. With respect to private equity, they're the next phase of capital. So the venture guys come in and they back the new ideas, but what about existing businesses? How do we scale existing businesses from 25 people to 250 people? How do we acquire another business and make it sort of minority or African American owned? That's where private equity comes in. And so if we have a healthy African American private equity base and a broader base that respects the deals that can get done with African American companies, it could be game changing and really start to right the imbalance of what has occurred sort of in the business world since the burning of Black Wall Street, right? So when I look at the private equity world, there are a lot of people who, I admire. Robert Smith is one of my mentors and heroes, and I look at the success that he's had. Robert is an incredibly talented guy, but I think that there's 250 other Robert Smiths out there that if they had the opportunity that he and I had, again, it would be game changing for our communities and it would really uplift, some of those cities you talked about earlier, like Cleveland and Detroit and
Mm-hmm.
Atlanta and other places where, the inner cities are struggling to get off their back from a financial perspective. So I think that private equity and venture capital, as well as commercial banking, is sort of the lifeblood of the success of not just a business, but, of a community. Without capital, it is really hard to take those ambitions and to magnify them and to scale them.
Let's now take a ride to the other end of the this chain, philanthropy. You sit or have sat on the board of some major philanthropies, the Cargill philanthropy of $7 billion, the Robert Kennedy Group, which when they do their conference, it literally represents trillions of dollars of
Right.
philanthropic wealth. You talked before about money being able to do a lot of good stuff. Talk about philanthropy a bit. Because it's an interesting world now. There's philanthropy, like the Gates Foundation was very broad. You get very specific philanthropy, and then you got this venture philanthropy. Talk about some of your vision for what philanthropy can do.
So at Blueprint, we call it the ripple effect. In other words, if you have a still pool of water and you can throw a small stone into it, the ripples kind of make their way across that whole entire body of water. Mm-hmm. And we believe that, there's no effort that's sort of too small, right? And so you have these major philanthropies that give, millions of dollars to entities, and they do a good job, with that money. But you also have all of these, what I'll call micro charities, that are too small to get money from the Ford Foundation. Or too small to get money from the Rockefeller Foundation. They don't do $2,000. They don't do $15,000. They don't do $25,000. And so as a firm, we decided that, we were going to really be serious about philanthropy and give back and recycle a portion of our profits back into the community in a few different ways. One, we want to train young women and minority kids and kids who come from, disadvantaged families, they could be white, in finance, because we think that finance as a career is a good skill to have inside of a family. But importantly, the kind of money that a child can make can uplift their family the way it uplifted, my family. And so pre-COVID, we were taking in upwards of 15 interns a year, a lot from underprivileged Newark families, training them up, helping them, fix their LinkedIn sites, helping them scrub their social media to look like professionals, telling them how to go about building a resume, working on their presentation skills, teaching them the principles of finance, and then sending them back to school and then tracking them as they go through school. And so that's one way that we've chosen to give back, is by training that next generation of talent. Because very often what you hear from major banks is, we would hire more, but we can't find them. So we're trying to create a pipeline of women and minorities that will be eligible for internships at the major banks and the investment banks and the asset managers for years to come. The second thing that we do is we give to nonprofits, whether it's religious or otherwise, mostly in the area of education. So we gave a pretty substantial amount to training the elderly on how to use, technology. We've given to early childhood centers. We've sponsored Christmas parties at nursing homes. And so it sort of runs the full gamut of opportunities. Pretty much, we set an annual budget, and then throughout the year, we take the calls. And so, we got a call, a few weeks ago. There was a need for someone to sponsor a couple of events around Ramadan. And so the call came in, and we said, okay, sure, we're happy to do it. And so, we will kind of fund anything that makes sense to us, where there's really a need. Now, what we're not focused on is sort of like the arts, sort of music and entertainment. To us, we're focused on the inner city, where there are basic human needs like food, education, of that sort, right? So that's one way. And then the third way is that, we give our time, right? So there are a lot of businesses in Newark who could benefit from our expertise. There are a lot of businesses in New Jersey and elsewhere who, through the profile of the firm, contact us, and we get back in touch with them and we tell them what we know, and we try and help them figure out how to position themselves, how to scale themselves, how to finance themselves. And so, we're doing everything that we can do. And it's important to remember that we have families and a day job too, but we do make that a substantial part of our daily existence at Blueprint.
Outstanding. Jacob, a couple months ago, you wrote this article, New Jersey Magazine, The Year of COVID, Sickness, the Fear of Dying, and Losing My Hero. And you talk about, obviously, that this was a year of many battlefields, racial, social, economic justice, dealing with COVID, your father's death. But you talked about family and that this was extremely important in holding it all together. Obviously, the very 2020 was a tough one for all of us. Talk about some of the positive things that you came out of sort of the time spent together with your family during this era of battles.
I sort of look at COVID and I say that by far the biggest challenge that we have faced as a nation, as a planet, right, in my lifetime, biggest challenge that we faced as an African American community, given a lot of the pre-existing conditions that a lot of African Americans have, like high blood pressure, diabetes, et cetera. And at a micro level, it was a challenging time for my family. I have two parents who are, among the elderly, and, they had pre-existing conditions. And so, while it was a frightening time, and the news flow coming in sort of exacerbated that, I tried to find and survive this by thinking about the positives that came out of, the pandemic.
Yep.
So, for example, I was again, under the same roof, having dinner with all of my children every single night. And I think we actually did that over 100 days in a row, right? The restaurants were shut down. And so, we were all forced to get creative, look up recipes, and each of us would take responsibility for preparing a meal. And so, we had fun sort of, cooking together and sharing, that as an experience. There wasn't much to do. And so we started hiking. And, that put us in touch with parts of New Jersey that we never knew.
Sure.
But importantly, it took us away from our laptops and away from our devices and put us back out into the community in a way that allowed us to communicate with each other. When you're on a hiking trail, you don't have an iPad on you. Put your phone down, take your ear pods out, like just listen to nature. And so, from our perspective, we had a chance to grow in a way that I never thought sort of would have been possible. One of my biggest fears as a parent is that, my kids would grow up and then one would be in San Antonio and one would be in San Francisco and one would be in Chicago and the other would be in Florida, right? And over time, the fabric that we tried to build would sort of fray. But what COVID did was it brought us all back together in a way that allowed us to reconnect if we had disconnected from one another, allowed us to see sides of each other that we hadn't seen and probably, wouldn't see. When your children finish college, they kind of go off and do their own thing. They don't usually come back home and stay for a substantial period of time unless they've had a hardship. And so, here we were not facing, a sort of personal kind of hardship in that way, but under one roof, sort of trying to find ways to keep each other entertained. We started doing karaoke. We started kind of binge watching Netflix series together. So, I kind of look at this and I say, wow, it was just a great opportunity to reconnect, with my immediate family. Obviously, we couldn't travel and see people because we were worried about spreading the virus. What it also did was, it got me out of the office. And for 30 years, when I tell you I worked really hard, I put in a lot of hours. And so now I no longer had an office to go into. I'm surrounded by all these trees and nature. And while I've always been balanced in terms of my values and my principles, I will say I was never all that balanced in terms of my time.
Mm.
And as I started spending more time in nature, it brought me back to my childhood in upstate New York, where, I woke up every morning in the summer and I went fishing, literally every day. And in the fall, we went hunting. But we were always out on the river, in the woods, trying to occupy our time. And so it just really brought me back to my childhood. And so now, I've pledged to, not go back to spending those kinds of hours in the office anymore. And now that it's halftime at 53 years old, really take advantage of everything that I've been missing that COVID gave me an opportunity to sort of reconnect with.
Yep, absolutely. It feels strange talking about silver linings, but yeah, I mean, there's something about these experiences and the reconnection. And I said, turning off the electronics and just, hey, there are families here. There's something special here.
Yeah, I mean, I got some great photos, some great, videos of karaoke. I mean, things we'll look back on,
right.
And we'll smile and we'll laugh and we'll appreciate kind of what this pandemic presented to us in the way of an opportunity. So I have 3 daughters. I call them glow getter number 1, glow getter number 2, and glow getter number 3. And they had to figure it out, right?
Yeah.
They couldn't go to a beauty salon. They couldn't go to a nail parlor. And so they started giving each other facials and doing each other's nails and learning more about how to serve themselves as opposed to, relying on other people to serve them. And so it's things like that I hope we all retain, right? And sort of value forever, not just say, okay, that was a fleeting moment in time that I really didn't learn something from. Because I do think that there were some really valuable, positive lessons that everybody should have learned from this pandemic.
Absolutely. Jacob, final question, and obviously I am not Becky Quick, and this is not CNBC, but if you could give us 30 seconds on what the hell all this crypto stuff is about, I would love to hear your take on it.
It's about volatility, it's about risk, it's about uncertainty, but it's been about profit, right? And so I guess what I'm trying to say is that please don't look at Bitcoin or Dogecoin or Ethereum or any of these other, cryptocurrencies as an opportunity to solely profit. When you decide you're going to make an investment in these cryptocurrencies, you're taking on a lot of risk and a lot of volatility. And I saw a meme the other day of a guy who was in bed, and it was like 4 o'clock in the morning, and he had his phone, right? And he's checking, where his cryptocurrencies are trading. And so I will say that it does, occupy a lot of someone's mental space when they get involved. And so I often worry that, retail investors, investors that, really aren't, sort of professional investors, get involved in something like this and think, it's going to be a one-way trip to the moon. Well, the truth of the matter is it has been, but you've had major swings up and down. So piece of advice, if you're going to do cryptocurrency, it should not be a substantial portion of your savings, right? And then the second thing I will say is put it away and say to yourself, I'm not going to touch this for 3 years. If you do that, I think you will make money. I don't think there's been a person who's bought crypto at any point in time who 3 years later did not make money. And so you got to figure out, how to game it, right? And I think that's how you game it is buy it, spend enough on it that you don't have to worry about it. You're not going to need it. And then come back 3 years from now and then go brag to your friends, how well you did. But if you think you're going to get in there and in the course of 6 months, you're going to become a crypto millionaire, I just haven't read that story too often.
Thank you for that. Jim, it's been really a great time talking with you, and really wishing you the best with everything you're doing. Obviously on the business front, obviously with all the other initiatives, and obviously with your family
Thank you.
throughout these times. For everybody that's going to be listening to this episode on the podcasts or watching on the YouTube channel, you've been listening to Jacob Walthour Jr., co-founder of the investment firm Blueprint Capital Advisors. Check out his website. Obviously, check him out on CNBC every week or so. Jacob, it was a wonderful time. I was going to take time. Thank you for taking the time out of your schedule to come on the show.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you for everything you're doing. And as we say on our show, thank you for helping to create a better tomorrow through what you're doing. Really inspiring stuff.
Great. Thanks so much.